Greetings from Riverside United Church, and this is the reflection for Good Friday in the year 2021. Good Friday is an important day. It's a difficult day. It's a time when we reflect on the meaning of Jesus' death. Among us and even within us, there are a variety of understandings and questions. It is a day when the reality of injustice and oppression and cruelty is personified in Jesus. It's a day when the gifts of grace and love and hope are personified in the crucified Christ. As we wrestle with the meaning of this day and the reality of suffering and pain in our world, and the faith to trust that we are not alone, as the Holy One is at work, with a power of love and compassion that gives us hope even in the midst of death. The gospel writers often use contrasts to highlight certain themes. Within the Passion story, there are some contrasts that help us to experience and to explore the depth of the story. So today we highlight three contrasts that are part of the story of Jesus' final days. And as we hear these reflections on contrast, the goal is not that we choose one of the possibilities, but to recognize how our lives and faith response is often a mixture.
The first scripture reading is from Mark, chapter 14, verses 1 to 9. It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. The chief priests and scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. For they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." While he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. But some were there who said to one another in anger, "Why has the ointment been wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii, and the money given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me. For you will always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her."
And reading from Matthew 26. Then one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I betray him to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him was a large crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him." At once he came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him.
In the first story, an unnamed woman takes a jar of expensive perfume and anoints Jesus' head. This is an act of love and care. Her action is criticized. After all, the perfume cost the equivalent of 3 days' wages. It could have been used for all kinds of other purposes, including care for the poor. Jesus has little patience for the criticism and affirms her act of love and faith. Although Jesus doesn't clearly say it, there is a sense from this scene that if only the poor were treated with such care and dignity. The act of this unnamed woman has not been forgotten. It is told in memory of her, in memory and celebration of her devotion and care, of extravagance and generous love.
In the second story, we hear a story told in memory of Judas. Except the memory of his action is not affirmed, but his betrayal is condemned. Judas was a disciple, one of the inner circle, and we don't know the reasons why he chose to betray Jesus and hand him over to the religious authorities who were threatened by Jesus' message and popularity. Was it greed, or fear, or anger, or misunderstanding, or selfishness? Did he think that this would have advanced the cause of revolution or atonement? Two followers, hours before his death, respond in different ways. Different motivations determine their behavior.
Today, as we gather remembering Jesus' death, the contrast of these two followers offers us an opportunity to reflect on our response as persons who are attracted to the message and power of Jesus. Are selfishness, greed, fear the prime motivation in our living, especially when things get tense or stressful? Or are love and generosity primary?
The reality is probably a mixture of both. And I suspect that most of us strive for a life where giving and caring are more common than selfishness and greed. How will our faithfulness be known and remembered? May others experience our lives and say that through our actions, our faithfulness was known. Contrast of two basins. Reading from John 13. Now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord. You are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you should do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them."
A reading from Matthew 27:11-26. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "You say so." But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many accusations they make against you?" But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Now, at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. So after they gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that they had handed him over. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" All of them said, "Let him be crucified." Then he asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." Then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." So he released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified.
The stories of Jesus washing the feet of the disciples and of Pilate washing his hands of responsibility for Jesus' death are not stories read together all that often. However, there is a basin, and the act of washing featured in both. And there's quite a contrast between how the basins were used.
The first basin. Jesus takes a basin and uses it to wash the dusty and dirty feet of the disciples. It was the custom, for example, when visitors came to a house for dinner. The host usually had a servant wash his guests' feet to make them feel more comfortable. So it was not unusual or unexpected that when the disciples gathered with Jesus for the Passover meal, that their feet would get washed. What was unexpected was that Jesus did the washing. He fulfilled the role of servant, and it gave a new and deeper sense of meaning to how he understood himself and how they were to understand themselves as his disciples. They had been arguing about who was the greatest. They were probably beginning to feel the prestige of being Jesus' disciples. They were being carried on the coattails of his popularity. And they probably liked their newfound status. Then there is this lesson of Jesus turning upside down the customs and their expectations as they learned that discipleship is about service and love, not about power and prestige. The towel and basin remains to this day as a symbol of discipleship and service.
Basin 2. Then there was the second basin, probably a much fancier basin made of bronze or silver, the basin used by Pilate. Pilate was the Roman governor in Jerusalem. He lived in luxury and power. Up until Pilate enters the scene, the charges and anger against Jesus were coming from the religious authorities. Caiaphas, the high priest, had power, but he didn't have the power of ordering an execution. For that, they needed the action of a civil authority, which at that time happened to be the Roman government in power. So they take Jesus to Pilate. From the story, it's quite clear that Pilate doesn't think that the evidence warrants a crucifixion, but when he tries to question the crowd, they shout, "Crucify him!" Pilate tries, but the public opinion poll is clear. They want him dead. So Pilate washes his hands of responsibility. The need to be popular wins over what he feels is right.
Two basins, two acts of washing. What a contrast. A contrast of perspectives or values that continues to find expression in our time and in our world. Over this past year, we have been asked to wash our hands a lot in this pandemic time. Each time that we wash our hands, we are serving and helping our neighbor as we limit the transmission of disease. And yet, there are some who have dismissed the whole pandemic and chosen to act without the responsibility for others in mind.
As we remember the forces that lead to crucifixion, we may ask ourselves, which basin do we find our hands in? Do we strive to serve, to care, to bind up the brokenhearted, cleansing the wounds and hurts of our sisters and brothers? Or do we try to wash our hands of responsibility for injustice and problems in the world, saying, we can't do anything about that, or I don't want to get involved? Which basin do we want our hands to be in?
The crucifixion of Jesus, as told in the Gospel of Luke.
As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" 2 others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by, watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, while the sun's light failed and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly, this man was innocent."
The story of Jesus' arrest and trial and death is a story of varying emotions, values, motives, and contrast. And one of those contrasts is the cross. What connotations does a cross stir within us? In Jesus' time, crucifixion was the cruelest form of death and punishment available. It was cruel because being hung on a cross was a slow, agonizing death, and so the cross was a symbol of pain, suffering, and cruelty. I remember a Sunday school teacher once sharing with me a concern that had arisen in her class. A couple of the children were struggling to understand why Jesus was killed on a cross, and the teacher was wondering how she could explain how cruel an act it was. I suggested that maybe she could talk about it being similar to the electric chair today, although I realize that Methodist killing is not slow and agonizing. And she replied that no, it wasn't the method they were having difficulty understanding. It was the motive. How could people be so cruel as to kill Jesus? The cross stands as a symbol of the worst of human motivation and behavior. Jealousy, power, greed, fear were all factors that led to the cross. And it's difficult to understand how could people be that cruel. And yet, as those children who asked will learn, those forces, those disguises of evil continue to be active in our world. There are too many stories of cruelty of human to human. So the cross is a symbol of cruelty, a reminder of the worst of our human behavior.
And yet, the cross is used extensively as a symbol, the corporate logo of the Christian faith. We see crosses in many sizes. We see them in churches, in homes, as jewelry. It must mean something else than cruelty. The cross is our corporate logo because the death was not the end of the story. Yes, it was cruel that Jesus was executed by the forces of evil, but the power of God was not killed on the cross. God's love and truth continued, and through Jesus' resurrection, those followers and disciples were transformed to continue sharing and living the message of grace, love, and hope. So the contrasting with cruelty, the cross is a symbol of love and hope. That is why we see a cross in churches, around necks, and on signs and posters, etc. As we gather on this Good Friday, it's not called good because of what happened to Jesus. It is called good because this day is a reminder that this is God's Friday, that each day is God's day. God's love and hope have not been executed or usurped or surpassed. We know that cruelty of violence and jealousy continue to find expression in too many places, and that the cruelty of indifference and silence mean that oppression is permitted to flourish. However, with the cross as our symbol of love, is not our responsibility to live in the world in ways that seek to empty all the crosses in the world? May we have the will and courage to be God's ambassadors of love and hope. Amen.